Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. 下午好, really 欢迎. I'd like to welcome our Chinese friends aboard, and I hope they can correct me as well as I have been corrected about my talk yesterday, where King Harold was the last Anglo-Saxon king in 1066, and other errors that I may give. But I'd particularly like to thank, before I start talking about the topic today, first of all, our audiovisual crew, Ramil and Edwin, who keep this theater going so well. Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be on this stage, especially with all the other distinguished speakers. And I particularly like to thank again the RADA performers, who I did not name yesterday. That was Naomi Cranston and Jeff Lewis, who could really curse like Vikings. So we thank them for joining in our little theater here, and they're one of the great treasures of being on the Queen Mary, too. I have worked many years in China, and as originally I worked many years with a company called Lindblad Travel, which chartered ships in Asia, and I was on the Yangtze River for many years, and then was director of a current fleet on the river called Victoria Cruises, which runs 10 river liners up and down the Yangtze from Shanghai to Chongqing. And I've spent many years going all around Asia in ships, so I have an interest in the maritime heritage of China in particular. And so I'm going to give you a historical view of the period in the Ming Dynasty when Chinese treasure fleets and exploration vessels went out from China to parts unknown at the time. And the intrigue is how far they got, because there's evidence in various parts of India and Africa, but the surmisings of the author Gavin Menzies talked about how they must have gone farther and found more, and so I'll talk about some of his speculations, I'd call them. But to begin with, I just show you this saying in Chinese, 四海为家, which means it's a sailor saying that the four seas are like our home, and so a sailor is comfortable traveling around the world, but of course likes to get home. The period I'm going to talk about now is in the Ming Dynasty, and particularly the Emperor Zhu Di, who took on the honorific Yongle, which means eternal happiness. He was the second Ming emperor who had been a warrior and had driven out the Yuan dynasty forces. The Mongols had run the country for the last dynasty for a few hundred years, and so this was the reestablishment of native Chinese rule to their own land. And this great emperor also initiated the construction of the great imperial palace. He kept rebuilding the Great Wall. So many of the monuments you see in Beijing and other parts of China come from his reign, most beautifully the Temple of Heaven in Beijing. Now, he had a realm that had sway over much of Asia, and many of these other countries were vassal states at the time, and there was maritime trade between them. And this is where the maritime innovations of the Chinese then led to larger explorations led by Zheng He, who is been called the Eunuch Admiral. He had been a young boy, had been born in Yunnan. He was orphaned and was given to Zhu Di as a servant, but he was particularly capable because he was multilingual. He could speak and write Arabic, because there had been Arab traders into China going back hundreds of years before that. But then he was also self-trained in navigation, cartography, and then he, as an imperial eunuch, was put in charge of the exploration fleets of that era. He lived to 1435. But there's no portrait of him from the period, but on his tomb in Nanjing there is this painting in bad condition. It's probably most of his likeness, such as it is, but he has now been vaunted in recent decades as the great Chinese navigator, comparable to, let's say, Columbus is in Europe. And he oversaw the construction of what the largest fleets ever built at the time, the largest vessels ever built. And here's with the Celestials blessing his fleet as they sail out of the Yangtze River Valley off into the world. This has become the stuff of popular novels, TV series, and soon to be a major motion picture eventually when it gets made, of these tremendous fleets. He had 7 different trips from 1405 to 1431 with up to 27 ships at a time. At one point he had troops of 27,000 people out on these expeditions. And so this was very large and tremendously expensive enterprise sponsored by the Emperor Zhudi to go out and express the power and the majesty of the new dynasty. So again, these are somewhat romantic paintings. There's Zheng He with his charts, and particularly there's the compass. Now that's the key Chinese invention that led their fleets to go to the west, and eventually it came to Europe and it was developed into the modern compass. Without that, they would have had far more trouble going out there in the world. On the banks of the Yangtze, there was this inscription now lost that was noted down: the countries beyond the horizon and at the ends of the earth have all become subjects to the most western of the western, the most northern of the northern, however far they may be. Now, scholars thought this was a typical exaggeration, but Menzies says that this was actually literal, that Zheng He and the other explorers went off to find the ends of the earth, and they went far and wide. Of course, Asia is just big enough to sail around in a sail ship, so they were definitely going to the vassal states and had a lot of trade with Korea, Japan, Vietnam, Indonesia, Cochin, Zanzibar, Madagascar, and there are tablets in various ports that commemorate the voyages of that period and then the trade that was common throughout East Asia, all the way down to Indonesia. Of course, that's a vast archipelago. There's many, many places that they had gone, but the main one, of course, was Sumatra and the island of Java. But Zheng He then extended that trade all the way up to northern Japan, down through the Philippines, off to Ceylon and Sri Lanka, India, to the Persian Gulf, to the Red Sea, and then down the coast of Africa. Now, this was not mainly done for, let's say, colonization, though they would leave representatives behind and begin the kernel of the current overseas Chinese community. There's about 100 million ethnic Chinese living all through Southeast Asia already at this point in history, but back then this was the initial trading network of the Chinese. There was never a military conquest. They never had any battles in this venturing out into the world. They did go to Sri Lanka, and the Ceylonese at the time were not welcoming of them, but they convinced them to finally trade tribute and gifts back and forth and establish some trade back all the way to the Ming Empire. They also went up to the Persian Gulf, went to Jeddah, Aden, down the coast of Mogadishu, down to Malindi and Mombasa, and all the way down to Sofala, which is down in South Africa. Now, they, again, were not a military mission. They had a few armed guards, but if they were pirates or something. But these ships were very big, and it must have been a tremendous sight back in the world when there were no such other vessels. There had never been any Europeans come quite yet to that part of the world. But again, a curiosity and exploration led it. So there were scholars back in Nanjing and Beijing who were interested in what they would find, what they would bring back. And here, in this case, a zebra. And this painting scroll is quite famous when they brought back a giraffe for the curiosity of the emperor, and it was in the imperial palace there until it got a cold one winter, I believe. So this was a great opening to the Chinese of the extent of the rest of the world, and of course the rest of the world were impressed by the ships that came. And again, just like I talked about the Norse nautical inventions, this was a very important development in maritime technology, that what were previously flat-bottom canal and river boats were then adapted to sea use. Here are some illustrations of some of the Yangtze River vessels. And of course, the inland waterways of China are very vast, connected by canals, the Grand Canal, and then connectors between South China and the Yangtze, and then from there up into the Huai River and all the way up to Beijing. This was the final destination of the Grand Canal. And so all of the saying is all of the goods from the south, being silk and rice and timber and all, would flow north on the canal system on boats like this. And in appreciation, the emperor would send troops and tax collectors back down south, not unlike it is today. So here's another image just of the Yangtze River. This is to the Jinshan, up on the course coming up toward Nanjing, and a sort of elaborate drawing by a European of some of the detail of some of these boats, which were quite decorated and quite handy in flat waters. They're not ocean worthy quite yet, but one of the innovations they did make is the stem post rudder, which is illustrated here, and that made a boat much more maneuverable. They also had sculling oars for the smaller vessels, but that single development made it possible for these craft to go out into the sea and keep a course. There had been many style of boats constructed, particularly along the Yangtze River Valley. This was one of the military, actually iron-clad boats that was used for leading other vessels into fights. So the Yangtze River history has many naval battles in different parts, but again, it's all shallow water. The boats didn't get quite so large, but some of them are quite elaborate. This is a floating fortress that was paddled off into the area or poled off for shooting off at the enemies. There were some great battles, particularly the one at Red Cliff. Here's one that was a human-powered paddle vessel, so it could get in close against the wind. Another one, it was a bombardier boat where the munitions would be put up against the fortifications, and you can see the links in the center of the hull could be detached and the explosives released toward the enemy, but the rest of the crew could back off and away. Then they developed larger seagoing vessels, originally coastal, but then as they developed better construction techniques, you see there's still fairly much not a keel, so they're flat-bottom boats. The keel is, of course, a Norse invention that the Chinese never had, but they had lee boards. If you see on the side, those great boards, that would help with stability out at sea. So this one was called the Sea Falcon with, again, the kind of the lug rig. The sail rig is important because those either cloth or bamboo could be lowered and according to the wind conditions. You didn't have to take down the whole sail. You could reduce or what we call reef the sail just by lowering the halyard, and it would stack up. So these sort of innovations with a deeper hull, higher prow, a deeper hull for containing goods was the model for the great treasure ships, which grew quite large. The imperial shipyard in Nanjing, which was drawn, now it is a site that's been covered with other construction. It was the site where they bring all the wood from South China, then they construct the world's largest vessels at the time. Now this is the description of Zheng He's own Baochuan, his treasure ship, which had 9 masts. It dwarfed the caravels of Columbus later in that very same century, but this was over 300 feet long. It had bulkheads for the watertight compartments. It had a garden on board. It had livestock on board, chickens, and also had a garden on the deck so that there would always be fresh vegetables. The Chinese sailors never knew scurvy because they always had something fresh to eat. So this was a pretty tremendous sight. It was recreated as an example in the city of Dalian a number of years ago, just to show you the size of the construction. You can see little cars on the side of it. So that's what they are particularly proud, that they had that size vessel back then, and they could have gone around the world in that size vessel. There was a rudder found in the bank of the Yangtze that it was preserved in the mud, and it was of this scale. So that is an example of how large the ship is, though it must have taken quite a bit of manpower to be able to steer such a vessel. There may have been other assistance for the steering, but none of these vessels have survived, nor have any of their nautical or their naval architectural drawings. There are a few samples of the traditional shipbuilding left. This one happens to be a Fuzhou coastal trading vessel that has ended up as a museum ship in Nagasaki, Japan. But it has the tiger in the front, that's the foreplate of the bow, and this vessel is called the Feifan, which means the flying sail ship, and a high deck that was used for spotting the course, the post rudder, which is through a couple of decks, and then the rig, which was like this one, a lateen rig, a lug rig rather, because there are bamboo battens all the way to the length of the sail. So again, you could drop it down depending on conditions and pick it up without having to tie it or reef it or change sails even. So this was not a fast vessel, but they were fairly stable. They're the wide beam, good draft, and so as they would go out from the rivers out to sea, these were fully functional sail ships. Here's one going with the wind on the Yangtze River. Now, most of these are lost. All of them have pretty much broken up. Even in Hong Kong, they only have one for show anymore. But they keep finding more and more wrecks. South China, in Guangdong province, they found one, about a 400-year-old wreck called Nanhai, the South Sea trader that they have made a ship museum, sort of like the Vasa in Stockholm. They are preserving it and build a building around it. So the Chinese nation is quite proud of this tradition now that it has been found in archaeology, and especially proud that they had these maritime inventions, the lug sail, the rudder posts, the bulkheads. Curiously, the bulkheads were considered to be invented by people who just saw how bamboo rafts could maintain their flotation because of the segmentation of the bamboo itself. And so when they started to build larger vessels, they would recreate that bulkhead, and that was, of course, a great innovation to keep ships safe and floating at sea, and now required for all maritime construction around the world. And I mentioned the fresh vegetables. Then they had the written sailing instructions. I mean, usually for instance, in the Mediterranean, this was a great secret of the pilots, is they would never give out written instructions to anybody else. It was considered a state secret or a personal secret to guarantee their advantage versus competition. But in China, the government published charts of various parts of the China coast and then eventually outer seas as they came back from the sea. The other invention, the compass, which was originally used for geomancy, was called a south-pointing spoon, nangan in Mandarin. And then the other important development was the determination of longitude, which I'll talk about in a minute. But just here are some of the charts. This is a very early one that has survived from 1351, the Guangyutu, which is of a coastal scene in South China, but particularly like the wave patterns that the cartographer drew in, and then there are different islands and a point of land there. And the coastal charts are now, many of them in many museums, but they're not geographically or hydrographically correct, except that they do note out the promontories and the islands and such. So if you are out underway, you could follow this, if not mathematically or geographically precisely. And so even this has you see that line of characters there, that's a description of how you stay off of the different islands. And the coast of South China is very rugged. It's full of inlets and rivers and things, and so it's quite tricky, and often you have to have the local knowledge to be able to get near the coast. Here is a map that ended up in a museum in Japan. It's called the Kanigdo map, which is a part of the Indian Ocean that's actually part of the Bay of Bengal. But that, in 1402, it's inscribed, made it all the way to Japan. And that's an example of how extensive the knowledge of the sea was and written down for others to use. Here's again a chart and instructions how to get through the Arabian Sea off to other parts of Africa and the Middle East. This information ended up in the hands of traders, and then finally in Venice, Fra Mauro drew this chart of the known world at the time, the Mediterranean there, and the Red Sea, the Persian Gulf, and then Madagascar down here. And this was decades before Pedro Diaz made it to Cape Town, Cape Hope. There had been traders from Europe that had gone to the Red Sea and knew this part of the world, but the curiosity of this map is in this inset that there's a vessel that's going around the end of Africa down there. And the question is, was that the Chinese who had this information that ended up in Venice and impelled the curiosity of Europe to go there? But what the Europeans didn't have that the Chinese did have was this compass. Now here's the original floating bowl with the magnetic lodestone in it, and it would be placed in a spoon, like a Chinese soup spoon. It would turn to south, is the way they set it up. This was used for geomancy and for fortune telling primarily. Here's another land-based one with a thread that would hold the lodestone with the directions on it. But this is not practical at sea. Here's another one in my own collection of, again, a fortune-telling feng shui compass with the magnetic needle in the center on a gimbal. And that's when it became practical for maritime use, when it was encased in a double gimbal, and then it could give a direction while the ship was rolling at sea. And this was the beginning of what became the world compass that we know, gimbaled, set often in a liquid, and today we still have some on board. The other point that the Chinese developed was celestial navigation. Of course, you know their astronomy was already very advanced with many observatories, so they took star charts to sea. This is a description of different constellations for use for navigation. But that was based upon a very mathematically precise determination of astronomical features. So there were platforms in all the major cities. This one happens to be in Beijing, right outside of on Tiananmen Avenue, Chang'anjie. And then they would place within these platforms a tall pole called a gaobiao, which was really a shadow pole, and then the platform would be marked with different indications or used as a sighter for sighting celestial targets. And then with the water clock timing, they could get a very close analysis of events, for instance, eclipses and comets and things that have been recorded. The distribution of these platforms meant that they could determine longitude by the comparative measure of celestial events. So from one end of the empire to the other, the records would come back to the Central Office of Astronomy, and then they could measure the distance exactly to the other locations. And so that's why the Chinese had a very clear idea of the longitude of their various outposts around the world. And it is surmised that their explorers built the same sort of observation posts as they landed in other parts of the world. Though we have yet to find, I'm not one of the actual researchers, but there has not been found a fully complete set of this on other continents, but there may be the ruins of it under the debris of modern times. But this predated European longitudinal calculations by about 300 years. The question is, did they only do it on land, or could they do it at sea? Because at sea it's more difficult, of course. In the Chinese records, they have talked about from the Han Dynasty on into the Ming, all these different explorers that went out, and particularly in the Han Dynasty, Shuangke made 2 journeys to the east, and he described people with large cities living on faraway continents, which may be Mexico by some estimations. And if you ride around the Pacific, you could in a large ship get all the way to the Americas by sea. But more well known, of course, Zheng He left a historical record, but there were others described briefly that Zhou Man went and found land south of Indonesia. Zhou Wen went around Africa, and it's surmised he may have even made it to the Americas. Yang Qing went around Africa also. Hong Biao went to the Pacific, and then again, Gavin Menzies surmised that he probably got close enough to the ice in Antarctica to describe that. So this becomes where history becomes legend, becomes speculation. And now, again, romantic paintings of these great explorers. This is Zhou Wen. Again, we don't know what he really looked like, but that's a pretty good view of a commanding explorer, sort of like the European explorers of that time were larger than life. But certainly these expeditions were sent out by the emperor, and there was a strong interest in what the rest of the world was, at least for this period in Chinese history. So again, out of Menzies' book, there's these surmisings that Hong Bao went to Australia, others, Zhou Man went up the coast of Japan and into the North Pacific. Others went down, certainly to Africa, where there are confirming records there. But the question is whether they actually went past Sofala, around Cape Good Hope, and then took the southeast trades up into the equatorial zone, where the other trade winds would take them across the Atlantic fairly routinely, just as sail ships do today. And again, Menzies surmises that particularly Zhou Wen went up the east coast of North America and then went up to polar regions. But this does not have any confirming evidence. But Menzies will insist, if you ever hear him speak, he's a Royal Navy commander who got interested in this period of history, but not a Chinese scholar. But he insists that the Chinese eventually went to America, some different parts of it, and there is evidence in some stone ship anchors, ship timbers, and then markers that have been found in parts of the Americas, which may be evidence of this age of exploration. More curious are the other elements that were in ancient America, particularly that there was rice that has been genetically identified as same as in Southeast Asia. Paper was known to the Aztecs and other Mayan people. That is a particular kind of technique that was, of course, a great Chinese invention. And then in Mexico, you can still to this day buy lacquerware, which is not a very easy thing to either develop or to make. And so again, it may have been a trade or a gift item from Chinese at some point in earlier history. Also in Mexico, they have copper processing, and some have said that if the Chinese went traveling anywhere, they were really looking for copper. That was very valuable and useful at the time. The camellia rose is an Asian flower that was growing wild through parts of North America to this day. And then the Mayan and the Aztec calendars have a lot of similarity to some of the ancient Chinese round calendars that they would make. And above all, if you listen to Thor Heyerdahl, for instance, the pyramid structure that is common in many ancient prehistoric cultures may have been initially a Chinese development. There are ancient pyramids in China that are now ruined. But and then there's the chicken. And the chicken is originally a little guinea hen running around in South China and Southeast Asia, but that had been domesticated long before. And to this day, all Chinese vessels will carry live chickens on board for food, but they also will sacrifice one for the initiation launch of a new ship. Well, when the Europeans came to the Americas, they found chickens. So how did they get there? They're not Native American bird. So again, this is surmising that there may have been small settlements by the Chinese. There was a tomb in Peru that had a skeleton of a horse prior to the European bringing many horses over. There was a ship timber in near Sacramento that was dug out, and it was carbon dated to the early 1400s. Again, may have been Chinese. When Verrazzano came up to Rhode Island, he described a village in the Narragansett Bay of people who looked quite different than any of the other natives and had a very square-built town with sturdy houses. And he didn't know who they were. They were completely different than any of the other natives he encountered. But Menzies, again, thinks that might have been the last of the Chinese settlements that were there in that particular part of the world. There's a platform in the Bahamas, which is looks like that astronomical platform for Judgment. It had sunk underwater. It's about 20 meters underwater off of Exuma. But he thinks that might have been one of the observatory platforms. And then there's the city of Marinco in the Amazon basin in the lower river that is that lost city that many have gone to find. And there are other ruins in the Amazon that are now all covered over that people don't know how they were there. But it is up to future archaeology to either confirm or deny these speculations. But just by sail instructions alone, if you can get over to the trade winds, it's very easy for a sail ship to continue up if you don't run aground in the Bahamas, then get up the coast in the Gulf Stream, in this case to Rhode Island or beyond. This map of Pisano Italian in 1424 has a drawing of an island off the coast in the center of the Atlantic in his chart. There was no continental mass nearby, but that drawing alone is so much like Puerto Rico with bays and land masses out. And so he may have had some information from somebody, we don't know, about this island of Antija, which is the name has continued on as Lesser and Greater Antillas to this day. Again, who was there to know that? Also, there were, in the early history of New England, there were markers on points on rivers, which were not native, but this is a Chinese custom to put markers on the river